One of the psychological factors which lays the foundation of individual behavior is learning. And in this lecture, I, Dr. Rasmeet Kaur Malhi, Assistant Professor, Department of Management from the Bhopal School of Social Sciences, is here to help you understand what is meaning and definition of learning, what are the characteristics of learning, components of learning, factors affecting learning, learning and its relevance in OB, principles of learning and theories of learning. So let's get started. A study on OB will remain incomplete without studying learning. If a manager wants to explain and predict human behavior, he or she needs to understand how learning occurs and how people learn. Learning is a very powerful incentive for many employees to stick to certain organization. It has a significant impact on individual behavior as it influences abilities, role perceptions and motivation. In simple words, learning is change in behavior as a result of experience. Learning is a process by which new behaviors are acquired. Now, there are few authors who have defined learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior on potential behavior as a result of direct or indirect experience. It can also be defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior potentially that results from reinforced practices or experiences. Now let's move on to the characteristics of learning. Learning can be characterized as that it results in change in behavior, and that change is relatively permanent in nature. Learning has to support and strengthen the behavior. It is a continuous process. It helps to achieve the desired result. Learning arises out of training or practice, and learning is not caused by the biological changes. Now coming on to what are the components of learning. The first component of learning is that it involves change. Change may be good or bad from an organization's point of view. A change may not be evident until a situation arises in which new behavior occurs. The second component of learning is that not all changes reflect learning. Changes should be relatively permanent in nature. The temporary changes can only be reflexive and fail to represent any learning. It rules out behavior changes caused by fatigue or drugs. Coming to the third component, learning is reflected in behavior. It means that if change in individual's thought process or attitude is not accompanied by behavior, it is not learning. Learning needs to result in behavior potentially and not necessarily in the behavior itself. Individual may learn, but owing to lack of motivation, may not exhibit the changed behavior. The fourth component is that the change in behavior should occur as a result of experience, practice or training. This implies that the behavior caused from maturity disease or physical damages does not constitute learning. The fifth component of learning is that practice or experience must be reinforced in order for learning to occur. If the reinforcement does not accompany the practice or experience, the behavior will eventually disappear. The sixth component of learning is that it is not implied in any standard definition of learning, which means that it is contrary to popular belief, but learning is not confined to one's schooling. Learning occurs throughout one's life. Now let's talk about what is learning explicit and tacit knowledge. When I say explicit knowledge, it means it is an organized and can be communicated from one person to another. It can be written down and given to others. It is only a small portion of the total knowledge. I take an example here. Student receives information in a classroom is mainly explicit knowledge because the professor transfers it to students. Tacit knowledge, which also means implied knowledge. It is the idea that one knows more than what he or she can tell. It is embedded in our actions and way of thinking. It is acquired through observations and direct experiences. Let's take one example here. A driver does not learn how to operate vehicle through lectures. He has those necessary skills by experiencing or watching the subtle details and by performing the task. Now, there are certain factors which determine learning. Let's discuss them. The factors which affect learning are the first and the very important, motivation. Nothing occurs without proper motivation. So, motivation is the first and the prime factor of learning. Coming to the second factor of learning is the quality of trainee and the learner. An efficient trainee can make difficult tasks easy for the learner. Let's come to the third factor, that is environment. If among a group of learners, majority is disinterested, it will affect a few who are very keen to learn. Let's come to the fourth factor, that is practice. We very often say that practice makes a man perfect. Without practice, it does not help much. So it is very important to keep on practicing what we have learned. The fifth factor is feedback and responses. It is important that the learner gets the feedback information of his or her performance at the regular intervals. This enables him to know how far he stands in relation to requirements. The sixth factor is meaningfulness of the subject. Learning is meaningful if the subject matter is meaningful. The seventh factor is time schedule. If the time given is too short, it will not help the learner. The eighth factor is retention. Retention means remembrance of the learned behavior. Learning which is forgotten is called extinction, that means loss of memory. The ninth factor is reinforcement. Reinforcement is anything done to strengthen or support the behavior. There are two types of reinforcements, positive and negative reinforcement. An employee who is very good in his work is usually given a reward. The reason being that he will excel every time. This reward is a positive reinforcement. Now, when we speak about a negative reinforcement, this means to restrain or to prevent a person. For example, an employee coming late always may be imposed a penalty. The reason is to discourage the occurrence of such behavior. For example, asking an employee to pay fine will bring change in his behavior. And the 10th factor is nature of learning material. Now let's move on to how learning is connected to organizational behavior, or I mean to say, what is the relevance of learning in OB. Learning is therefore considered for understanding human behavior at work in the organization. Learning helps the manager to change behavior in different situations. The first example of it can be how to reduce absenteeism. Learning can help the managers to evolve programs to reduce absenteeism. Second can be improving employee discipline. Late arrival for work, coming for work in drunken condition, thefts at workplace, frequent quarreling with superior and workers can be reduced through learning. Next area can be by developing good training programs and by substituting well pays for sick pays, which means to prevent the misuse of sick leave facility, the employee can introduce a system of rewarding employees with regular attendance in the form of benefits. Now let's move on to what are the principles of learning. First is motivation. Second is reinforcement, punishment and extinction. Third principle is whole versus part learning. The fourth one is learning curves. Fifth is meaningfulness of material. And the last principle is the learning styles. Let's start with the first one, that is motivation. Without motivation, learning does not take place, or at least it is not discernible. Motivation can be seen at different levels of complexities of a situation. Coming to the second principle, that is reinforcement, punishment and extinction. Reinforcement. It is used to enhance a desirable behavior, whereas punishment and extinction are employed to minimize the undesirable behavior. Reinforcement is an attempt to develop or strengthen the desirable behavior. There are two different types of reinforcement, positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. As we have discussed earlier, that positive reinforcement strengthens and enhances the behavior by presenting the positive reinforcers. Now, when I speak about these positive reinforcers, they can be further classified as primary reinforcers, secondary reinforcers, and conditional reinforcers. Coming to the first one, that is primary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers means to satisfy the biological needs of an employee, which includes food and water. Coming to the secondary reinforcers, now these are those benefits which include money, status, grades, trophies, and praise from others. The third type of reinforcer is conditional reinforcers. Due to association with the primary reinforcers, they are said to be the conditional reinforcers. There are certain principles of reinforcement. Let's discuss them. The first principle is principle of contingent reinforcement. Now, when I speak about this word contingent reinforcement, it states that the reinforcer must be administered only if a desired behavior occurs. Coming to the second principle is principle of immediate reinforcement. This states that the reinforcer will be most effective if administered immediately after the desired behavior has occurred. Coming to the third principle of reinforcement on the basis of size. This states that the larger the amount of the reinforcement delivered after the desired behavior, more effect the reinforcer on the frequency of desired behavior. And the last principle is principle of reinforcement deprivation. This states that more a person is deprived of reinforcer, greater is the effect it will have on future occurrence of desired behavior. Now let's discuss what are negative reinforcements. Negative reinforcement means any kind of an unpleasant event that preceded a behavior is removed when the desired behavior occurs. It increases the likelihood that the desired behavior will occur. It stimulates the strengthened response that permit an organism to avoid or escape from their responses. The supervisors apply negative reinforcement when they stop criticizing the employees whose poor performance has improved. It is sometimes confused with punishment because both use unpleasant stimuli to influence behavior. Coming to the second point, that is punishment. It is an attempt to eliminate or weaken the undesirable behavior. It is used in two ways. The first way to punish a person is to apply a negative consequences called punishers following an undesirable behavior. And the other way to punish a person is withhold a positive consequences following an undesirable behavior. Coming to the third one, that is extinction. It is an attempt to punish undesirable behavior. It is the weakness of a behavior by ignoring or making sure it is not reinforced. Extinction needs time and patience to be effective. Let's come to the third principle, which says whole versus part learning. A great deal of work has been done in psychology of learning to decide whether learning a whole job by superior or to break the job into parts and learn the parts is easier. In breaking the part, or if I say in part learning, individual is not required to learn each and individual part, but he or she must be able to combine separate parts so that the whole performance can be accomplished. Coming to the fourth principle of learning, that is learning curves. It is valid for wide range of situation and highly useful concept. It is a diagrammatic representation of amount learned in relation to time. Rate of learning increases or decreases with practice. It has certain characteristics or features. Let's discuss them. The first one, that is spurt. Rate of learning exhibits a spurt at beginning, which indicates maximum performance has been achieved. Subject is highly motivated and seems to exhibit significant surge of effort. Experienced trainers exploit this initial spurt by selecting most important items to be communicated and presenting them at the beginning of the training. The second characteristic or feature is learning plateau. There is flattening off in terms of improvement. The process of learning is marked by discontinuities and involves escalating from one plateau to another. Most learners are aware of experience of finding themselves on a plateau which manifests itself in feeling. The third feature is organization of learning. Jumping from one plateau to another is called as organization of learning. It is achieved when the learner discovers a new and more effective method of performing a particular task. The fourth feature is disorganization of learning. It is an actual fall of the performance. It arises when the subject has to choose between the alternative methods of tackling a task. And the last one is end spurt. It is preceded by fatigue which is likely to set in the passage of time. When the training session draws nearer to an end, it occurs resurgence of interest and effort to learn more, and this is called end spurt. The fifth principle is meaningfulness of material. A definite relationship established between learning and meaningfulness of subject learned. More meaningful the material is, better does the learning proceed. Each task, trainers have certain techniques that increase the meaning for the trainees. Organizing meaningfulness unit, creating association and providing conceptual basis of logical reason for material are some of the practical possibilities. The sixth principle is learning styles. This refers to an ability of an individual to learn. Managers' long-term success depends on the ability to learn than on the specific skills or technical skills. There are different styles of learning. The first style is accommodator style. It means learning by doing and feeling. It tends to learn primarily from hands-on experience and act on feeling rather than logical analysis. It relies more on people for information while making decisions. The second style is diverger. This means learning by observing and feeling. A diverger has ability to view concrete situations from different angles. It takes time and analysis with many alternatives. Diverger is an imaginative and sensitive person who understands the needs of other people. He seeks careers in entertainment, arts and service sectors. The third style is converger, learning by doing and thinking. Converger seeks practical use for information. He tends to focus on solutions while dealing with problems and making decisions. He prefers to deal with technical tasks rather than social and interpersonal relations. It seeks a technical career in scientific fields, engineering, IT and so on. The fourth style is assimilator, which means who learns by observing and thinking. An assimilator is effective in understanding wide range of information and putting it into more concise and logical form. It is more important than an idea or theory is logical than practical. He tends to be more concerned with abstract ideas and concepts than with the people. He seeks careers in education, information and science. Now let's move on to the last topic of today's lecture, that is theories of learning. The first theory and the very famous theory of learning is classical conditioning theory, which is also known as stimulus response association theory. The classical conditioning theory is given by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian psychologist. His theory is based on how to teach a dog to salivate in response to ringing of the bell. Pavlov offered the dog meat and noticed that the dog starts salivating. Afterwards, without offering meat, he merely rang a bell and the dog has no salivation. At the next step, he rang the bell before giving the dog meat. This went on for some time. Thereafter, Pavlov merely rang the bell without offering meat and noticed that the dog was salivating. The dog thus learned to respond. The classical conditioning theory has some relevance in understanding human behavior at workplace. For example, they expect of a hike in their pay when they know that the financial position of the organization is very sound. There are certain limitations of this theory. First limitation is that human beings are more complex to understand than the dogs. The second limitation is the behavioral environment in the organization is also very complex. The third limitation can be that the human decision-making process, being complex in nature, makes it possible to override or overrule. Let's come to the next theory, that is operant conditioning theory. B.F. Skinner, a psychologist, is given a credit for his contribution to operant conditioning theory. It focuses on relationship between behavior and its consequences. He says a particular behavior is likely to be repeated if its consequences are favorable. For example, when an employee who has performed his or her task very well and is rewarded by the organization, he is likely to repeat his performance in future too. The behavior of the employee may have a positive or negative consequence. The repeat behavior will be called as a positive consequences. No repeat or less likely repeat behavior can be said to have a negative consequence. Let's understand what is the difference between the classical conditioning and operant conditioning theory. The classical conditioning theory is basically based on the behavior which is the result of stimulus. And in the operant conditioning theory, the behavior is not the result of stimulus, it occurs spontaneously. In the classical conditioning theory, the response to the stimulus is fixed, that was salivating of the dog. Whereas in the operant conditioning theory, the responses may vary. It can be positive or it can be negative. In the classical conditioning theory, the stimulus is presented every time for response to occur. Whereas in the operant conditioning theory, the stimulus is presented only if the desired response occurs. Let's come to the third theory of learning, which is known as cognitive theory. Cognitive theory, it means gaining of knowledge through thoughts and senses. Cognition is the act of knowledge. It refers to individual's thought, knowledge, understanding or views about oneself in his or her environment. For example, Kohler presented 2 sticks to a monkey in a cage. Both the sticks were too short to reach to a banana laying outside the cage. What monkey did without any prior exposure, joined both the sticks together and pulled the banana inside the cage. Learning took place inside the mind of monkey. Thus, the learning process involved in this case. This type of learning is very important in organizational behavior for changing attitudes by the individual. Knowledge of cognitive theory is also helpful in understanding the concept of motivation better. In the previous 2 theories, learning was explained through stimulus and response, whereas in this theory, the learning did not emphasize on the process of receiving, memorizing and reacting to stimuli, which is vital in learning. Let's come to the last theory of learning, that is social learning theory. Individuals also learn by observing their models whom they admire. Social learning theory is based on the view that a person learns by observing others, such as their parents, teachers, friends, film artists, superiors, and at times their fellow workmen. It occurs due to influence of the role model. Learning through both observation and direct experience has been called under social learning theory. The following process determines that the model will have on an individual. The first one is attention process. A person learns from a model that has impressed him the most. The models that are attractive, repeatedly available, or important influences us the most. The second process is the retention process. It depends on how well the individual can remember in his or her memory the action or behavior displayed when the model is no longer available. The third process is reproduction process. The individual needs to convert the model's action into his or her own actions. This process shows how well an individual can perform the modeled action. And the last one is reinforcement process. Individuals will be motivated to display the actions of the model if incentives and rewards are provided to them. So with this, we conclude the concept of learning, which is a very important part of individual behavior in organizational behavior. Thanks for watching this video.